instruments used today, the shofar is the most ancient. Its origin is found within the most dramatic event in the life of our father Abraham. The Jewish tradition calls it a-shana, the binding for sacrifice of Isaac. The weekly Torah reading, a-shana, is particularly important to understand the nature and depth of disclosure of this, the first of the names of the shofar, KEREN. In this chapter, we find the very first mention of the word KEREN in the Bible. Later, this horn, KEREN, becomes a musical instrument full of symbolic meaning. It is a horn of a ram, which God provided for himself, and that Abraham offered as a burnt offering instead of Isaac. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here am I. And he said, Please take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place far off. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father. He said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the 2 of them went together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, Here am I. Abram was 75 years old when the Almighty called him out of Haran. And the Lord gave a new name to our father, Abraham, which means the father of many nations, the name that contains both a purpose and an indication of how it is to become a reality through a wonderful fatherhood. So the eternal God opened an eternal vocation to Abraham. He laid a great destiny upon him and his descendants, to be a blessing to all nations. Perhaps it was then that Abraham heard in his heart the call of the horn, KEREN. Our mission extends into eternity if we are faithful to the one calling us. It is like a ray of light stretching on into eternity. A light ray has its beginning, its source. Without it, there is no light. This source keeps empowering and supports the light and spreads it everywhere. The light ray in Hebrew is called KEREN. This is the same word which we have seen means the horn of an animal, and it is one of the 3 names of the shofar. Besides, it is used to mean the horn of the people, or the glory and the calling of this people. As it is written, in your favor our horn is exalted.
ברצונך תרום קרננו.
Призвание всегда соединено с жертвой.
Calling is always connected with the sacrifice. The sacrifice and the calling are two important things that are central to the story of the Akedah. It is highly symbolic that the second mention of the horn, KEREN, in the scriptures has to do with God's command concerning the altar. Moshe constructed it in the desert in the image of the Heavenly One. You shall make its horns on its four corners. Its horns shall be of one piece with it. And it is in connection with the altar that we often find the word horn, KEREN. It is clear that the horn of the altar is not intended for blowing, but genetically precedes the name KEREN of the sounding horn. The earthly horn of the altar is closely associated with the horn which calls from the heavens, and the repeated appeals of the Torah to the horns of the altar is a reminder that glory and calling, KEREN, is inextricably connected to the sacrifice and the ordeal of the sacrifice of Isaac. Abraham had to pass through a great test, a test of faithfulness. God speaks to him with a terrible request: take your son and sacrifice him to me. In testing Abraham, God asked him to sacrifice his son. In so doing, he gave him a free choice. In the original Hebrew, the words exactly express a request. Literally, it should sound like this: I ask of you, or please, take your son.
קח נא בנך את יחידך.
Archaeologists claim that Canaan was inhabited by pagans in those days, and that they had a ritual of firstborn sacrifice. Whether building a house or a city or undertaking any other important project, they sacrificed their firstborn. Thus they were buying the goodwill of gods, so that the business or the city or whatever it was could be successful and last for a long time. It was necessary, in the view of the person bringing this bloody human sacrifice, to be a condition for the future. Abraham's willingness to fulfill the words he heard and to follow the call cannot be explained by the same motives that guided the Canaanites who sacrificed their children. Abraham had to do the opposite of what the Gentiles were doing. He had to sacrifice his son and withdraw from the future itself by his own will, to give up everything he had wanted for years. He had to sacrifice his dream. His mission depended on Isaac, on Yitzchak. Being born by Sarah neither first nor last, he was the son of promise. Yitzchak was a ray Keren, aspiring to eternity and carrying light of blessing to all nations. He was a glory Keren of Abraham. He had a seal of the Almighty. He was a horn Keren stretched out into the future. In him was the calling of Abraham. In this sense, he was the only one. Losing him, Abraham was losing everything a person could lose. He was losing himself. Abraham would have been happy to give his life to God, to sacrifice himself. Because with Isaac there, his life was not in vain. It brought great fruit. Oh, it was not in vain. His dream, his mission, everything he was looking for with all his heart had come true. Here he is, an elderly man, the happiest of fathers, blessed, wealthy, and a son. Regardless of everything and everyone, against nature at the age of 100 years old, he had a son. The son grew up and became strong, standing firm on his feet. His Yitzchak, his Isaac, his laughter and joy. And Abraham now has the one who will inherit all his property, his experience, his knowledge. He was certain that the promise would come true. Yes, all the promises will come true. As his being an old man and seeing the light of his life almost go extinct, there is great meaning, purpose, knowledge, which he could not dream of. A calling, KEREN, that no man before him had been called to. God promised him many descendants, a great nation, a holy nation, a royal people, people who will be a blessing for all living on the earth. Great salvation will come of him, and every tongue on the earth will praise the King of the universe, the artist, the creator, his friend. Yes, the one who made the heavens and the earth, who commanded the sun and the stars and the waters of the sea, obey him. He was his friend. And Abraham had experienced the immense generosity of his friend, his great grace and faithfulness, his everlasting and infinite love.
И вот друг предложил ему доказать свою любовь, которая тоже...
And now, his friend invited him to prove this love, which should also be infinite, if one can expect infinite love from a finite human being. Infinite love. This meant for Abraham to give everything that he had, his dream and his joy, his priesthood and kingdom, his great blessing, his Isaac, Yitzchak, for the sake of his love and friendship. As it is written,
ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, your mind, and with all your strength. Abraham was shocked by what he heard. Take your son. Maybe even then in his heart, he heard the special call, the voice of the shofar, anxious and awful, simple and great. His heart trembled, barely recognizing the piercing vibrations. Always. When the calling voice of the shofar, KEREN, sounds, it reminds of the calling and sacrifice. The voice of the shofar is always the voice of a sacrifice, a desperate cry of a sacrificial animal being led to the slaughter.
ויקרא אליו מלאך אדוני מן השמיים ויאמר אברהם.
But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven, and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing, and have not withheld your son, your only son. In blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven and the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice.